Hello again and welcome back to the PhatPhish Guitar Studio. I'm Dave, and in this video we're going to be taking a deep-ish dive into the world of dominant chords. I did a video recently looking at diminished chords, and that just got me thinking about another type of chord which has got some really interesting properties and useful ways we can exploit them. So I thought we'd take a look at that in this video, so let's go. Start off with where do we find dominant chords. I guess the best place to start is our old friend C major, and we look at the chords involved in the key of C major. As with the video on diminished chords, this isn't meant to be a detailed tutorial on how to do chord construction. I've got other videos on the channel about that, but if you're familiar with the idea of chord construction, it's about taking each degree of a scale and then taking alternate notes from the scale on each of those degrees and building chords. So if we start in the key of C major, we've got these notes. We add alternate notes onto each one, taking notes exclusively from the scale. Just take three notes, it gives us triads. So we look at this, we've got C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, and B diminished. Only three types of chord here: major, minor, and diminished. If we extend those out to include a seventh degree, though, something interesting happens. We get some other types of chord coming in. Adding that seventh degree in on the first degree goes from a major triad to a major 7 chord. On the second degree we go from a minor triad to a minor 7 chord. Similarly on the third degree we get a minor 7 chord. Fourth degree we get a major 7 chord. On the fifth degree we get a dominant chord. All this started from a major triad, the same as the chords on the first and fourth degree. Because of the notes in the key that we're using, we've got G, B, D, and normally the seventh degree of G would be F sharp, but F sharp doesn't belong to the key of C major. So what we do is we lower that by a semitone to get us to an F natural. So rather than having the formula 1, 3, 5, 7 like a major 7 chord does, we've got a chord with a formula 1, 3, 5, flat 7. Different type of chord altogether. And that's called a dominant 7th chord, so called because the 5th degree of the scale is the dominant degree. Each degree in a scale has a name, like the first degree is the tonic, and we get other names like the mediant and whatnot. That's quite sort of like traditional music theory. Personally, I prefer just to use numbers like first degree, second degree, third degree. It just makes a bit more sense. There's no harm in knowing what the names are, but I tend not to use those as like my primary reference. There's no reason why you need to either. But yes, the fifth degree of the scale is called the dominant, and the type of seventh chord that's built on that fifth degree is called the dominant seventh chord. And looking through the rest of this scale, we've got the minor 7 chord on the sixth degree and the minor 7 flat 5 or half diminished chord on the seventh degree. So the only place where we get this chord with the formula 1, 3, 5 flat 7 is on the fifth or the dominant degree. And if we just quickly compare and contrast the sound of those chord types, we've got a major 7 chord, minor 7 chord, dominant 7th chord, and minor 7 flat 5 or half diminished chord. So each chord type has got its own distinctive sound, and that's because of the intervals involved. And the dominant 7th chord has a particular sort of characteristic. It's got a slightly unresolved sound to it, like it wants to go on somewhere else. It's not a natural resting place. And if you look at the intervals involved, you can kind of see why. If you look at a major 7 chord or a minor 7th chord, the intervals between the first and the third, the first and the fifth, the third and the 7th, or the flat 3rd and the flat 7th, all the different intervals in the chord, they're fairly happy, resolved sounding intervals. If you're just looking at the basic chord tones 1, 3, 5, and 7, or 1, flat 3, 5, and flat 7 in the major 7 or minor 7 chords, they're all fairly resolved, consonant sounding intervals. And when you take the 7th degree of a major 7 chord and lower it by a semitone, what happens with the intervals in there, instead of having an interval of a perfect fifth between a 3rd degree and a 7th degree, we have an interval of a diminished fifth, 6 semitones, between the 3rd degree and the flat 7th degree. Now that's quite a dissonant sounding interval. When you include that in a chord, it sounds a little bit unresolved and it wants to kind of move on somewhere else. And that's why the dominant 7th chord is so often used as a chord, like the second last chord in a sequence, because it leads you on to resolution on the tonic. Like this, so a very common chord progression would be something like a 6 minor 7 chord to a 2 minor 7 chord to a 5 7 chord to a 1 major 7. So you've got that sense of resolution there. It's a perfect cadence, as it's called, perfect cadence from 5 7 to 1 major 7, or the 1 chord, 5 chord to the 1 chord. So that's major key. What about other keys? Well, we'll look at a natural minor, for example. We started off our examples here using C major. Now the relative natural minor of C major is A natural minor. We'll look at that. Yes, there's a dominant 7th chord there, and it's on the flat 7th degree. So in the key of A natural minor, the flat 7th chord is G7. But if we look at what happens when we play a perfect cadence in a minor key, the 5th chord in a natural minor key is a minor 7th chord. So in the key of A natural minor, we go from an E minor 7 chord to A minor 7 chord. That doesn't have the sense of urgency to resolve. That E minor 7 chord, it sounds, reasonably content just as it is. What we could do though is we could substitute in, and this is a really common chord substitution in the minor, substitute in a dominant 7th chord. So instead of playing a chord with a formula 1, flat 3, 5, flat 7, we raise the 3rd degree up by a semitone to give us a chord with a formula 1, 3, 5, flat 7, a dominant 7th chord, so we'll go from an E minor 7. Instead of playing that, we'll play an E dominant 7th, which sounds more unresolved, more like it wants to move on somewhere else, and then we can go to the 1 chord. So yeah, that gives you much more urgency and wants to be resolved. So that's a really common use of a dominant 7th chord in the natural minor, as well as being used as the diatonic flat 7 chord, using a dominant type chord there, is substituting in a dominant type of chord on the 5th degree. Looking at the other types of minor scale that we've got, like the harmonic minor and the melodic minor, if we look at the types of 7th chord that occur in those keys, just because of the way the notes are organised, the intervals between them in those types of scales, you naturally get a dominant 7th chord on the 5th degree in both the harmonic minor and the melodic minor. Melodic minor, you also get a dominant 7th chord on the 4th degree. But yeah, that 5, 7 to 1 minor chord sequence in a minor key, quite common, very useful. As for that dominant 7th chord doesn't belong in a natural minor, substituting it in, it's a perfectly valid thing to do. That's the thing about music theory. It's a set of rules in one way, but it's also a set of rules that can be broken. So you could think of them more as being just guidelines. But if you understand the theory, you understand where that dominant 7th chord comes from. You can think of it as being like you're temporarily getting the sound of a harmonic or a melodic minor. You think of it, you understand the intervals involved in the chord and how they relate to each other and why that chord works. It's the case of knowing the rules before you can break them. And exploiting the sound of the chord gives you a very effective chord sequence in a natural minor. Other ways we can use the dominant 7th chord, it's really, really useful in a blues context. If you think about a dominant 7th chord, we're talking blues, so let's do something in the key of A. An A dominant 7th chord has got A, C sharp, E and G. Now that works quite nicely as you can think of it as being a hybrid of major and minor. It's got the major 3rd, but it's got the minor flat 7, the flat 7 that you would get in a natural minor scale of a minor pentatonic, because we're talking about blues here. So what you can think about doing is, if you're playing in, say the key of A, you would be playing as the one chord, either an A minor if you're playing in a minor key, or an A major if you're playing in a major key. How about playing an A dominant seventh, and then playing a blues over the top of it? So you've got that sort of like major lift of the major third, the natural third in that dominant seventh chord, because it's derived from the major, but you've got that slight dissonance from the flat seventh being in there, and that like major minor duality. So using a dominant seventh chord, like a non-diatonic dominant seventh chord, is where you would normally play a major chord in a major progression, use a dominant seventh chord. So we could play a blues, say start on a major chord and then shift to a dominant seventh chord, like in a 12-bar blues, something like this. Yeah, so using diatonic major chords and bringing in dominant seventh chords as well. The only diatonic dominant seventh chord there was the E major, was the E dominant 7 on the 5th degree. By rights, I should have been playing major seventh chords on the 1 and the 4, but they wouldn't have sounded bluesy. I wanted a bluesy sort of sound, so I'm bringing in the dominant seventh chord. It's okay to use chords that don't belong to the key, as long as they give you the sound that you want. Ultimately, let your ears be your guide, and you will find dominant seventh chord and dominant type chords get used a lot in a blues context. So you could just use a major chord, or you could go to a dominant seventh chord for a bluesy sort of sound, or maybe extend it to a dominant 9. 1, 3, 5, flat 7, 9. Gives you slightly richer sound, getting into more jazzy territory. We could get into things like 7 sharp 9s, like altered chords and things like that, but that's a whole other rabbit hole to go down. I'll not dwell on that for now. But yeah, getting a bluesy, jazzy sort of sound, dominant seventh chords are really, really useful. One last example I'll show you. We'll do this as staying in a major key. I'll stay in the key of C major, so I'll need a capo. One moment, please. Okay, so capo at the 3rd fret. I'm going to start off with a C major chord. It's like an A shape, but I'm capoed at the 3rd, so it's a C major. Then from C major, I could go to C major 7, which is a diatonic chord. Then go to an outside chord. Instead of playing a major 7, so what I've done is take the root note, the octave root, down a semitone, to a 7th, lower that note again to a flat 7, gives me a dominant 7th chord. Now that chord there is sounding a little bit weird. It's an outside chord, it sounds unresolved, it wants to go somewhere. That's why I've introduced it. It doesn't belong to the key, so it sounds a bit strange and we need to get away from it to something. But in fact, it's a dominant 7th chord, which naturally has a slightly dissonant, unresolved sound, wants to go somewhere. And the most natural place for it to go is for the root to go up an interval of a perfect 4th. So we'll go from a C dominant 7th chord to an F major. That sounds really nice. And then we go, say, to D minor 7, which is the 2 chord, then say G7, and finish on C major. So that gives us a sequence like this. That's quite interesting because you've got the C7 chord, doesn't belong to the key, completely outside the key, but we're using it as a passing chord, something from outside to give us a bit of tension to move the progression on. But then towards the end we've got the G7, which is a completely diatonic, belongs to the key, 7 chord, to give us that perfect cadence. So we've actually got a 2, 5, 1 sequence there, going from D minor 7, G7 to C major. Dominant 7 chords working in 2 different ways there, both as an outside chord to give tension and as a diatonic chord, just using their natural sound. So there you go, a deep-ish dive into the world of the dominant chord. Hopefully you've found that interesting and it's inspired you in some way to go off and, particularly with the idea of using outside dominant type chords to add a bit of tonal flavour to your chord progressions. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please click like down there. If you really enjoyed it and you want to see other videos that are posted on the channel, then please click subscribe, which is also down there, and click that bell icon, which gets you notified anytime I upload any new videos onto the channel. You're welcome to leave a comment, but I don't always get notified by YouTube when people do leave comments on videos. So if there's something specific you want to ask me, whether it's about music theory, guitar playing, guitar gear, anything at all, you're better off going here, fill that form in, send your question, and it comes direct to me and I can get around to answering it in a future video. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.